Israel continues its military campaign in Gaza. Battles are raging across the enclave. Israeli forces are pushing further south and are now in the heart of Khan Yunis, Gaza's second largest city. The UN estimates up to 90% of Gaza's 2.3 million people are now displaced. Secretary General Antonio Guterres is warning public order in Gaza is on the brink of breaking down. The Hamas-run health ministry says more than 18,000 Gazans have been killed in the war. Over the weekend, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly welcomed to Ottawa a delegation of foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Palestinian Authority. That delegation is calling for an immediate ceasefire. To date, Canada has stopped short of going that far. Mélanie Joly is Minister of Foreign Affairs. Minister, welcome back to the show.
It's a pleasure, David. I'm happy to be with you.
I'd like to start off, if I could, with your meeting the weekend with the foreign ministers from Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and the Palestinian Authority. What more can you tell us about what you discussed at that meeting and what plans may come out of it?
So the goal was to hear their points of view on what's going on in Gaza, what happened in Israel as well, but also to work, as I've been working with many other players in the regions, including, of course, Israel, on how we can address the threat posed by Hamas, but also about a lasting peace for the region. And so it was a constructive meeting because, you know, there's nothing like being there, seeing your counterpart, having real discussions, right, and frank discussions, because what is happening in the Middle East has an impact in many, many countries around the world, including, of course, ours as well.
But very divergent views in that meeting. I mean, Canada has repeatedly said it supports Israel's right to defend itself in accordance with international law. The readout from this group talked about the need to protect innocent civilians from what they call the killing machine practiced by the Israeli occupation forces. So how do you find common ground and a common position there?
I think where we agree is at the end of this conflict, there will be at one point a table of negotiation. Hamas won't be at that negotiation table, but there will be...
Do they agree with that?
Well, I think, this is our conditions for sure. And it is the case for the entire G7. But at the same time, there will be Palestinian voices. There will be Israeli voices. And we need to make sure that we work many countries together to bring back on track the discussion on the two-state solution. It needs to be a credible path. There needs to be a credible path for making sure that this is feasible. We've been talking about it for 30 years. There's lots of skepticism regarding this important approach. It's been Canada's long-standing position that we are in favor of having an Israeli state next to a Palestinian state living side by side in peace and security. But now more than ever, after this conflict, it will be important that it's put into place. And that's why I've been having important conversations with countries such as Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Jordan, Egypt.
So clearly a two-state solution is not on the table with Hamas at the table, but can it work with the Netanyahu government? I mean, they are promoting the expansion of settlers into the West Bank, supporting that, and they're being criticized for the way they're conducting their operations inside Gaza, to the point that a lot of the world considers them illegitimate in other ways. I mean, can it work with Benjamin Netanyahu at the table?
Well, I think that how Israel is conducting itself in Gaza is important. Why? Because we need to make sure that civilians are more protected. At this point, we're at 18,000 Palestinian civilians and military that have been killed. There's 70% of these people were women and children. So it is very, very, very concerning what is going on right now. Humanitarian aid is not allowed enough to go in. So there's an impact on food, water being available, medicine. There used to be 55 hospitals and clinics working in Gaza. Only 5 are left. So we're facing a humanitarian issue that is at a level we haven't seen in the world in a long, long, long time. So that, to come back to your point, we expect the Israeli government to be in favor of a two-state solution. This is our long-standing position. And I've had difficult conversation, to be frank, with my Israeli counterpart and many Israeli different voices about this very issue. And we've been clear also that we do not agree with extremist settlers' violence happening in the West Bank. We've had a clear declaration also about this that was issued a month ago. And we expect Israel also cracking down on these extremist settlers that are putting Palestinian lives at risk.
You say you want the violence to end, and you say there will be a lasting
Yes.
peace, but Canada has not joined the calls for a ceasefire. There's going to be a vote at the United Nations General Assembly tomorrow out of frustration with a ceasefire resolution being vetoed by the United States. How will Canada vote on that, and how do you get to the end of violence if people don't call for a ceasefire?
Well, indeed, we need to make sure that there is the violence must stop. Indeed, again, the cycle of violence is not helping Israel's long-term security, and we need to make sure that the way that Israel is conducting itself is in line with international humanitarian law. So
Do you think
on
right
the
now?
question of the resolution, David, that you asked me, we are still looking at the different versions of the resolution. We're negotiating. There are different amendments that are being discussed, so I'll have more to say tomorrow on this very issue.
Okay, but on the question of defending itself in accordance with international law, more and more we're hearing aid groups saying they're not. I mean, I'm no expert on this and I can't pass judgment. How does Canada view it based on the evidence you've seen and the 18,000 dead as you've
See, I
referenced?
think at the core of our foreign policy since the Second World War has been Israel's right to exist, which is fundamental, and at the same time, protection of civilians. And clearly, there are tensions between these two priorities right now. But eventually, of course, we will support any form of accountability system at the international level that will look into this issue. Meanwhile, what Canada has been clear is that we fund UNRWA, which is the organization that helps Palestinian civilians, their healthcare system, their humanitarian system. And we've increased our funding. Canadians expect us to do that. We are calling for more humanitarian aid to go in. There's not enough, like I mentioned. I met with all the humanitarian organizations that have been working on the Canadian side in Gaza. I've heard their call for help and for support, and I'm working with the Minister of International Development, Ahmed Hussein, on this very issue.
So, but just on the resolution tomorrow, I know there's some negotiations going on, as you say. Canada abstained last time because an amendment didn't get enough support to take effect on the motion, if I remember correctly. And the idea was to have a condemnation for Hamas for what it did on October 7th at the time. But since then, as you said, like about 10,000 more people have died. And the United Nations seems to be kind of paralyzed for various reasons to take even a firm position on what to do about this conflict. I mean, could we see Canada abstaining again if you don't get the sort of resolutions, the amendments that you're counting on?
Well, the Secretary General of the UN took a bold action last week, which was basically enacting Article 99 of the UN Charter and calling what was going on in Gaza a humanitarian catastrophe. So, we have to bear that in mind when taking our decision. But as I mentioned, we will look at the last text. We've always been clear that all hostages need to be released. More humanitarian aid needs to go in, be allowed in, and we need to make sure that Canadians be allowed out. I've been hearing the calls of so many Canadian families that are frustrated with the fact that their loved ones are still stranded in Gaza. And I hear them, but we're not in charge of saying yes or no. Israel is working with Egypt. And so we need to make sure that foreign nationals, including Canadians, are able to allow out. And I hear also the call for an extended definition of who is allowed out. I know you would be asking me this question.
Yep.
And I'm working with the Minister of Immigration, Mark Miller, on this issue because I think we need to have a more compassionate approach.
So even if they're not permanent residents or Canadian citizens, but they do have family here and have that strong connection, you would consider that?
We're looking at different options and coming up with a decision very, very quickly.
Okay, we're tight on time,
Yes.
but one last question I want to ask you about.
Yeah.
President Zelensky is going to be in Washington tomorrow.
Yes.
The U.S. Congress is so far refusing to pass any kind of additional aid packages for Ukraine, and they badly need it if they're going to stay in this fight with Russia.
Of course.
How important is it for the U.S. to deliver on this? How worried are you for Ukraine that the Republicans in the U.S. in particular seem to be holding this up?
It is extremely important that the U.S. support continues, as it is important as our support continues. And what we saw last week was the Conservative voting against the support that we're providing to Ukraine.
Right, but the military aid from the U.S. is the backbone of the Ukrainian defense.
I agree,
right?
David. But it is also about burden sharing. It is about making sure that many countries around the world, particularly those part of NATO, are able to support at the level required by Ukrainians. Because Ukrainians, you and I know, and everybody watching us knows, that they're fighting for their freedom. But they're fighting also for our freedom, because what's at stake is the security of Europe and our transatlantic security.
There are tensions in Europe, though, too, just as a final point. You know, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban is threatening to veto, if he can, or obstruct any new aid, and get in the way of veto accession talks with Ukraine to the European Union. So you have unrest in Europe, a reconsideration there, and blockades happening in the United States. I mean, how worried should we all be about Ukraine's viability in this fight in the short term?
I think that what happened is when Russia decided to legally invade Ukraine, it was a strategic defeat on their part. Why? A strategic bad decision on their part, because they isolated themselves diplomatically, politically, economically, and militarily. Mm-hmm. We need to continue to have that edge over them. And that is why we'll continue to support Ukraine. We'll push the Conservatives here at home to make sure that they get the message and get with the program. And meanwhile, we'll support, of course, the Biden administration and the EU as a whole to continue the support to Ukraine. And of course, provide Ukraine with EU accession, which is fundamental for their future.
Foreign Affairs Minister Mélanie Joly, good to have you back on the show.
Thank you.